You think you know the story. A bored girl follows a white rabbit down a hole and tumbles into a world of talking cats, mad tea parties, and tyrannical queens. A whimsical adventure. A children's classic. Pure imagination. But what if I told you that Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is not a fairy tale at all? What if the rabbit hole isn't a gateway to magic, but a descent into something far more disturbing? Published in 1865, at the height of Victorian moral rigidity, Lewis Carroll's narrative has been celebrated for over a century as innocent nonsense literature. But beneath the surface of talking animals and impossible logic lies something that was never meant to delight children. It was meant to prepare them. Wonderland is not a magical realm. It's a coded map of a fracturing mind, a diagnostic record of neurological terror, and a visceral chronicle of Victorian trauma. The Mad Hatter wasn't whimsical. He was dying of mercury poisoning. The Queen's arbitrary violence wasn't fantasy. It was a mirror of the British legal system, and Alice herself, growing and shrinking, losing her sense of who and what she is, wasn't experiencing magic. She was experiencing the clinical symptoms of a rare neurological disorder that wouldn't be named for another 90 years. Once you understand what Wonderland really is, you'll never see it as innocent again. Because this story wasn't written to entertain. It was written as a survival manual for a world where adults are mad, authority is arbitrary, and childhood itself is under siege. The most immediate horror of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland lies in what it actually documents. When Alice grows to the size of a giant, her neck stretching like a serpent until her head strikes the ceiling, this isn't whimsy. When she shrinks to 10 inches tall, the room expanding around her into an impossible cathedral of space, this isn't imagination. These are clinical descriptions of a rare neurological disorder that would later be named Alice in Wonderland syndrome. In 1955, psychiatrist John Todd identified a condition characterized by profound distortions of visual perception, body schema, and the experience of time itself. Patients describe objects appearing impossibly large or distant, their own hands transforming into alien appendages, their sense of self fracturing into pieces. They call these episodes micropsia and macropsia, medical terms for the terror of watching reality bend. Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, the man who wrote under the name Lewis Carroll, suffered from severe migraines preceded by visual disturbances. The narrative functions as a diagnostic log of these momentary short circuits in the brain. When Alice finds her hands appearing as distant as piano keys, when she questions whether her feet still belong to her body, she is navigating the boundaries of a self that is no longer physically stable. Consider the scene where Alice cannot judge the height of the mushroom before her. This is dysmetropsia, the impaired perception of size and spatial relationships. The mad tea party, frozen perpetually at 6 o'clock, reflects temporal desynchronization, where time itself becomes unreliable. And when Alice asks that devastating question, "Who in the world am I?" she is experiencing depersonalization, a sense of profound detachment from her own body and mind. But this physiological fracturing serves as more than medical documentation. It becomes a metaphor for the adolescent search for identity amidst the chaos of physical development. The fluidity of Alice's body symbolizes the psychological fluctuations of puberty, where the sense of self becomes precarious and unstable. The caterpillar's question, "Who are you?" becomes an existential threat because Alice, experiencing both neurological and developmental shifts, literally does not know. From a Freudian perspective, the descent into the rabbit hole represents a journey into the unconscious mind, that reservoir of repressed thoughts, memories, and desires that Victorian society demanded remain hidden. The irrationality and chaos of Wonderland reflect the unpredictable nature of this inner psyche, where the numbing of the conscious mind during sleep or trauma allows suppressed feelings to surface. The story was not meant to prepare children for a magical journey. It was meant to prepare them for the inevitable encounter with their own hidden, often conflicting impulses. the self they would meet in the dark. The Victorian era was obsessed with categorizing madness. Asylums multiplied across England, each one designed according to principles of moral architecture, where the physical structure of a building was intended to create order in the inhabitants' disordered mind. The increase in institutions attempting to distinguish between idiots, lunatics, and persons of unsound mind created a culture of surveillance and confinement that permeated every level of society. Wonderland mirrors this social reality through its spaces of entrapment. The hallway Alice encounters at the start of her journey serves as the primary example. She finds herself physically trapped by her own size, unable to enter the beautiful garden she glimpses through a tiny door. This is not metaphor. This is architectural imprisonment. The hallway represents a controlled society where a child's imagination, disdainfully termed castle building by Victorian psychologists, was pathologized as a distraction from productive capitalist roles. The space is designed to produce suffering. The tightness of the room, the inability to leave, the constant awareness of a paradise just out of reach. These are the sources of Alice's unhappiness, and they suggest that the impairment lies not in the individual but in the social environment itself. Victorian society viewed any child who could not conform to rigid behavioral expectations as potentially defective. Under the law, anyone incapable of managing himself could be forcibly committed to an asylum where they were imprisoned as securely as criminals. The criteria were deliberately vague, allowing families to institutionalize inconvenient relatives, women who refused marriage, children who asked too many questions. Carol uses the characters of the Mad Hatter and the Cheshire Cat to critique these strict binaries of sane and insane. The Cheshire Cat's claim that we're all mad here is not playful absurdism. It's a radical subversion of the entire Victorian project of categorization. If madness is universal, then the state's claim to identify and contain it becomes exposed as arbitrary tyranny. By naming and centering madness as a potentially liberating force, Carroll enters a vibrant discourse on disability and mental health that his contemporaries were desperately trying to suppress. The bourgeois child, the one with leisure time to sit by a riverbank and feel bored, was expected to prepare for a life of social management and moral instruction. But that same child was also constantly surveilled, their every behavior interpreted as evidence of future character. A girl who daydreamed too much might be seen as prone to hysteria. A boy who questioned authority might be destined for criminality. The architectural spaces of Wonderland, with their impossible geometries and constantly shifting dimensions, reflect this paranoid reality where the environment itself is designed to test, measure, and ultimately control the child who moves through it. The very structure of the narrative, with its abrupt transitions and disconnected episodes, mirrors the fragmented experience of moving through institutional spaces where logic is replaced by administrative caprice and where survival depends on learning rules that are never explicitly stated. Beneath its whimsical surface, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland functions as a sophisticated critique of 19th century industrial capitalism and its dehumanizing effects on the human body. In Wonderland, living beings are consistently treated as instruments or commodities, reflecting a process that feels intuitively wrong to a child but has been naturalized by adults through decades of industrial practice. The Queen of Hearts croquet game represents the height of this industrial grotesque. The croquet balls are live hedgehogs, curled into trembling spheres of fear. The mallets are live flamingos, their bodies forced into unnatural positions to serve as tools. This is not absurdist humor. This translates the logic of capitalism, where people become things and things take on the power of people, into a children's fable. In this world, a person's value is determined solely by their utility. Modern adaptations make this violence even more explicit. In Tim Burton's 2010 film, animals serve as living furniture, footstools and table supports, their bodies contorted to hold up the weight of their masters. What might have seemed whimsical in Carol's text becomes recognizably violent when visualized, forcing viewers to confront the cruelty they had been trained to overlook. Alice's experiences frequently parallel the harrowing accounts documented in the 1842 first report of the Children's Employment Commission. This parliamentary investigation revealed that children as young as 4 were working in narrow mine shafts, harnessed like animals, their growth permanently stunted by malnutrition and the crushing weight of the earth above them. Alice's struggle to fit into the rooms of Wonderland mirrors the physical incompatibility of industrial spaces with a child's needs. These were environments designed for maximum extraction, not human flourishing. Reformers like Henry Mayhew noted that child workers often lost all childish ways, becoming women in thought and manner due to the demands of labor. The theft of childhood, the forced premature aging of the young, was not an unfortunate side effect of progress. It was the intended outcome of a system that valued productivity over humanity. Alice's own class position is revealed through her indignant rejection of the study of washing when the Mock Turtle describes his curriculum. She maintains her class bearings, noting her education in French and music while refusing to acknowledge manual labor as legitimate knowledge. This shows that she is a product of the very system she is trying to escape. Her adventure through Wonderland does not free her from class consciousness. It reveals how deeply those hierarchies have been embedded in her understanding of what it means to be a person. The story warned its readers about the ways in which the industrial machine strips away what Wordsworth called the celestial haze of childhood innocence, replacing it with the world of material fact and instrumental utility. In Wonderland, everyone is either using someone or being used. There is no relationship that exists outside this framework. The very language of the text reinforces this reality. Characters are constantly asking, "What are you good for?" reducing identity to function. When the caterpillar asks, "Who are you?" he follows it immediately with "What size do you want to be?" as if identity and utility are interchangeable concepts. This industrial logic permeates every interaction, turning what should be social encounters into negotiations over value and use. One of the darkest elements encoded in the text relates to the normalized use of toxins and narcotics in the Victorian household and industry. The characters of the Mad Hatter and the Duchess provide warnings about environmental and medical dangers that faced the 19th century population, dangers that were widely known but systematically ignored by those in power. The Mad Hatter is a direct dramatization of what was called Mad Hatter's disease, mercury poisoning caused by chronic inhalation of mercury nitrate during the hat-making process. Hatters used mercury to treat felt, and the repeated exposure caused severe neurological damage. Symptoms included memory loss, tremors, emotional instability, and profound behavioral changes, leading to the phrase "mad as a hatter" entering common usage. Carroll's Hatter, with his unreasoned arguments and eccentric behavior, typifies the industrial worker whose mental stability was sacrificed for consumer goods. The medical community understood this connection by the mid-19th century. Doctors documented cases, workers testified to parliamentary commissions, and yet mercury use in hat-making was not banned in England until 1941, nearly a century after Carroll wrote his book. This delay highlights the industrial indifference to working-class suffering that Carroll satirizes through his character. The Hatter is not mad because he's whimsical. He's mad because he's been poisoned, and everyone knows it, and no one with the power to change it cares. The Duchess's baby presents an even more unsettling critique. The infant howls continuously and is violently shaken before eventually transforming into a pig. This scene has been interpreted as a critique of the Victorian practice of dosing infants with narcotics to keep them quiet. Soothing syrups like Mrs. Winslow's. Soothing syrup contained morphine derivatives and were marketed to exhausted mothers as a way to calm fussy babies. These preparations were responsible for thousands of infant deaths, which were often recorded as accidental opiate poisoning in official documents, but were actually the predictable result of giving narcotics to children whose bodies could not metabolize them. The baby's transformation into a pig mirrors the physical deterioration described in medical reports of the time. Infants given regular doses of opiates became lethargic, their cries weakening to pathetic mewling, their skin taking on a grayish pallor. The Duchess herself subverts the angel in the house ideal, that Victorian fantasy of perfect maternal devotion. She is a mother who resents her role, eager to abandon her child, using violence and verbal threats to enforce silence. When she sings "Speak Roughly to Your Little Boy," she inverts the didactic poem "Speak Gently," exposing the hypocrisy of adults who preach gentleness while practicing domestic violence. The Victorian household was saturated with toxins, arsenic in wallpaper, lead in paint, laudanum in every medicine cabinet. Children were dosed with opiates for teething pain, coughs, and inconvenient energy. The domestic sphere, imagined as a sanctuary from the industrial world, was actually a site of chemical warfare against the most vulnerable. Carol's text exposes this reality by making the violence visible. When Alice drinks from bottles labeled "Drink Me" and eats cakes labeled "Eat Me," she is engaging in the exact behavior Victorian children were encouraged to perform. Trust what adults give you. Consume without question. The fact that these substances cause violent and unpredictable transformations is the horror beneath the whimsy. Victorian education was built on the principle of rote learning, repetitive drills of multiplication tables, geography, and didactic poetry intended to instill a specific moral code. Children were expected to memorize vast quantities of information without understanding its meaning or application. This system was not designed to foster intelligence. It was designed to create obedient subjects who would accept authority without question. Carol uses the nonsense genre to deliver a brilliant critique of this educational model, showing how these lessons fail a child when they are removed from the rigid context of the schoolroom. Alice repeatedly attempts to use school drills to check her ever-changing identity. She tries to recite her multiplication tables, but they come out as nonsensical jabber. She attempts to recall the capitals of Europe and produces absurdities like London is the capital of Paris. This mirrors the interviews with child workers in the 1842 parliamentary report, who, lacking formal education, gave similarly jumbled answers when quizzed by investigators. The children knew their answers were wrong, but they had no framework for understanding why. Carol suggests that such knowledge is useless when facts lose their meaning, and that the forced identity education imposes on the young is as arbitrary as any of Wonderland's transformations. Carol specifically targets the didactic poems of Isaac Watts, which were required knowledge for British children. These poems emphasized the innate sinfulness of the child and warned that idle hands were the devil's workshop. Against idleness and mischief celebrates the industrious bee who improves each shining hour. Carol's parody, "How Doth the Little Crocodile," replaces the bee with a predatory crocodile that welcomes little fishes in with gently smiling jaws. The shift is devastating. Industry is not virtue, it's predation. The child who works hardest is not morally superior, they're simply better at concealing their appetite for violence. The poem "Speak Gently" preaches kindness to children. Carol's version, "Speak Roughly to Your Little Boy," sung by the Duchess as she shakes her screaming infant, exposes the gap between what Victorian society claimed to value and what it actually practiced. "The Old Man's Comforts," a poem celebrating the wisdom of age, becomes "You Are Old, Father William," where the elderly man is revealed as a ridiculous figure whose supposed wisdom is just eccentricity and stubbornness. Through these parodies, Carol criticizes rote school learning without getting into trouble for being offensive. The nonsense genre provided plausible deniability, allowing him to mock the system while appearing to simply play with language. The mock turtle and the griffin, with their curriculum of reeling and writhing and uglification, satirized the manageable absurdity of Victorian schooling, which aimed at cramming information rather than fostering actual understanding. Education was not meant to liberate, it was meant to discipline. The mock turtle weeps continuously as he describes his education, suggesting that learning itself was a form of suffering, a violence done to children in the name of their improvement. His very existence, a turtle with the head and hooves of a calf because mock turtle soup was made from veal, literalizes the way education transforms children into something they were never meant to be. The curriculum he describes, with subjects like ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision, reveals what Victorian education actually taught beneath its stated goals. Not knowledge, but the emotional management necessary to survive in a hierarchical society that would crush any genuine curiosity or creativity. The Queen of Hearts stands as one of literature's most terrifying symbols of arbitrary power, often interpreted as a parody of Queen Victoria herself and the tyrannical nature of the British government. Wonderland is a world where law is not a set of rational rules, but a weapon used by the powerful to control the weak. The Queen's constant demand, "Off with his head," represents the arbitrary authority of a state that uses fear as its primary mechanism of control. The trial of the Knave of Hearts dramatizes the institutional indifference of the Victorian legal system. The Queen demands sentence first, verdict afterwards, inverting the entire premise of justice. This was not pure fantasy. The Victorian legal system punished the poor severely for petty crimes, while the wealthy received leniency or avoided prosecution entirely. A child caught stealing bread could be transported to Australia. A gentleman who committed fraud might face a fine. The trial in Wonderland is a ridiculous mangling of justice, but it accurately reflects the class-based double standards that governed real courts. The gardeners painting white roses red because the Queen wants it that way alludes to the English Wars of the Roses, suggesting that the structures of power are built on arbitrary allegiances and the cover-up of mistakes. The gardeners are terrified not because they committed a moral wrong, but because they failed to anticipate what the Queen would demand. This is the logic of totalitarianism, where the rules change at the whim of the ruler and subjects must constantly guess what will keep them safe. The playing cards themselves, flat and identical, represent the interchangeable subjects of a monarchy that sees its people as objects to be arranged and discarded. They have no individual identities, only numbers and suits. They exist only in relation to the Queen's desires. When Alice recognizes that they are nothing but a pack of cards. This is a radical moment of empowerment. The child exposes the rulers as arbitrary tyrants with no real power beyond what the subjects grant them. This revelation serves as a call to arms, urging children to turn the staid Victorian world of strict morals and manners on its head. But the story never suggests that this awakening is easy or without cost. Alice must first be threatened with execution, must first endure the humiliation of the trial, must first be reduced to tears of frustration. Only then, at her breaking point, does she find the courage to name the Queen's powerlessness. The survival element of the story, the way Alice must constantly negotiate with hostile authority figures while maintaining her sense of self, reflects the real skills Victorian children needed to navigate a world that did not value their well-being. The monarchy in Wonderland is cardboard, but the fear it generates is real. And that gap between the theatrical nature of power and its very real capacity to harm is what makes the Queen so terrifying. She is absurd, and she is dangerous, and those qualities do not cancel each other out. They reinforce each other, creating a ruler who is both ridiculous and genuinely capable of violence. The courtroom scene extends this critique by showing how institutions legitimize arbitrary power through ritual. The trial has all the trappings of proper procedure. There is a judge, a jury, witnesses, evidence. But none of these elements actually function. The jury writes down meaningless notes. The witnesses contradict themselves. The evidence is nonsensical, and yet the trial proceeds as if it were legitimate, as if the performance of justice were the same as justice itself. This is Carroll's most devastating insight about Victorian society, that its institutions were fundamentally performative, that they maintained power not through actual legitimacy but through collective agreement to pretend they were legitimate. A significant portion of the dark mystery surrounding Alice in Wonderland involves the life of its creator and his relationships with young girls. Charles Lutwidge Dodgson's reputation has been posthumously tainted with possibly pedophiliac tendencies, though scholars continue to debate whether his affection for young girls was an innocent Victorian aesthetic or a troubling fixation. What cannot be debated is that the story itself is saturated with anxieties about the transformation from child to adult, about the loss of innocence, and about the ways bodies become sites of scrutiny and judgment. Alice's constant size changes represent the bodily frustrations that accompany puberty, where the child's body becomes unfamiliar and uncontrollable. She does not choose these transformations. They happen to her, often at the worst possible moments, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. The caterpillar, with its phallic shape and its question about Alice's impending bodily transformation into a butterfly, serves as a sexual threat that compounds her self-doubt. When he asks, "Who are you?" he is not asking about her name. He's asking what she is becoming, and the question contains an implicit judgment about whether that transformation is acceptable. When Alice's neck grows like a serpent and she is accused by the pigeon of being a serpent who eats eggs, the logic forces her to doubt not only who she is, but what she is. The pigeon's reasoning is airtight within its own framework. Little girls eat eggs. Serpents eat eggs. Therefore, little girls are a kind of serpent. This absurd syllogism represents the way Victorian society constantly defined and redefined children according to adult needs and anxieties. The child's own understanding of themselves was irrelevant compared to how adults chose to categorize them. The story reflects a deep fear of growing up and the anxieties about responsibilities, maturity, and social expectations in a rigid society. Alice wants to return to her proper size, but she doesn't actually know what that size is anymore. She has lost the stable reference point that would allow her to judge whether she is too large or too small. This mirrors the experience of adolescence, where the benchmarks of childhood no longer apply, but the markers of adulthood remain out of reach. The Michelson Alice, Carroll's own working copy of the withdrawn first edition from 1865, contains annotations and sketches that reveal the author's obsessive thinking as he refined the story for very young readers. This suppressed edition, pulled from circulation due to dissatisfaction with the printed quality, adds a layer of mystery to the fractious relationship between the author and his creative outlet. What did he change? What did he decide was too explicit, too revealing, too dangerous to leave in print? The existence of this suppressed version suggests that there was content Carroll himself recognized as inappropriate, thoughts he had committed to paper and then attempted to withdraw. The physical body of the child becomes a site of constant surveillance and interpretation in Wonderland. Alice is told she is too large, too small, the wrong shape entirely. Her body is commented on, measured, judged by every creature she encounters. This reflects the Victorian obsession with the female body as an object requiring constant management and control. Young girls were corseted, their movements restricted, their natural energy pathologized as hysteria. The story captures this claustrophobia, this sense that the body itself is a trap from which there is no escape. To understand why this story exists in the form it does, one must examine the emotional bleakness of Charles Dodgson's life at Christ Church, Oxford. He was bound by archaic rules to remain celibate and take holy orders, trapped in an institution that demanded conformity while he felt himself to be fundamentally at odds with adult society. He was a man of contradictions, a stodgy traditionalist academic who found the company of girl children preferable to that of adults. Dodgson's childhood in Daresbury Parsonage was reportedly happy, but his 3 years at Rugby boarding school were an ordeal he described in terms of loathing. He endured savage bullying and a complete lack of privacy, later stating that no earthly considerations would induce him to repeat those years. This early trauma likely contributed to his troublesome stammer and the cold, remote face he presented to colleagues. Wonderland, then, served as a therapeutic space where he could navigate the emotional discomforts of his life and confront the real self he kept hidden from the academic world. The story became a place where the rules that constrained him could be suspended, where authority could be mocked, where children could be powerful, and adults could be exposed as frauds. But there is another layer of darkness here. In June of 1863, there was a mysterious break in Dodgson's relationship with the Liddell family. His diary records a resolution not to see the children again, but the entries explaining why this happened were later destroyed by family members. The subsequent destruction of his diaries from this period suggests a potential scandal that the narrative of Wonderland may have been intended to both express and conceal. Speculation has centered on whether this rift was caused by an inappropriate interest in Alice Liddell herself, or perhaps her older sister, or possibly a rumor that he was wooing the children's governess. What remains is a gap in the historical record, a pothole that biographers circle endlessly without ever reaching solid ground. The story that emerged from this period is a story about losing access to a child, about being separated from innocence, about the pain of exclusion and misunderstanding. Alice falls down the rabbit hole and finds herself in a world where she doesn't fit, where everyone speaks in riddles, where the rules make no sense, and where returning home becomes an obsession. Is this the geography of Wonderland, or is it the geography of Dodgson's own psychological exile? The Christ Church environment was one of rigid hierarchy and performance of masculine academic authority. Dodgson, who struggled with public speaking due to his stammer, who preferred the company of children to his peers, who never married and died a virgin in his 60s, existed in profound isolation within this system. The story he created allowed him to be both the excluded child Alice and the various adults who refused to help her, playing out his own fragmentation across multiple characters. The White Rabbit, perpetually anxious about being late, mirrors Dodgson's own anxiety about failing to meet institutional expectations. The Caterpillar, hostile and condescending, represents the academic colleagues who dismissed him. The Queen, arbitrary and violent, embodies the institutional power that could destroy him at any moment. And Alice herself, trying desperately to remember the rules and failing, represents the part of Dodgson that never successfully adapted to adult life, that remained fundamentally childlike in its confusion and vulnerability. The photographs Dodgson took of young girls, many in poses that modern viewers find disturbing, add another dimension to this analysis. He sought permission from parents, followed social conventions, and yet there remains something unsettling about the gaze captured in these images. The girls are often dressed in costumes, positioned in tableaux, transformed into characters from his imagination rather than allowed to exist as themselves. This photographic practice mirrors the narrative structure of Wonderland, where Alice is constantly told who and what she should be rather than allowed to define herself. Victorian England was a society saturated with opiates. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was available over the counter and used for everything from menstrual cramps to teething pain to insomnia. The middle and upper classes consumed it regularly, often without acknowledging their dependence. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater had been published decades earlier, but addiction was still seen as a moral failing rather than a medical condition. Some scholars have suggested that Wonderland itself reads like an opium dream, with its fluid transitions, impossible juxtapositions, and the sense that Alice is floating through events rather than actively shaping them. The eat-me and drink-me substances that cause her transformations can be read as pharmaceutical interventions, chemical solutions to the problem of not fitting into prescribed spaces. This interpretation gains weight when we consider the mushroom that the caterpillar smokes and later offers to Alice as a way to control her size. One side makes you larger, one side makes you smaller. This is not magic. This is dosage. The caterpillar is teaching Alice how to self-medicate, how to chemically adjust herself to meet the demands of her environment. The drowsiness that pervades certain scenes, particularly the dormouse falling asleep repeatedly at the tea party, reflects the narcotic haze that many Victorians lived in without recognizing it as artificial. The tea party itself, with its obsessive rituals and circular conversations that go nowhere, mirrors the repetitive thought patterns of the opiate user whose mental life has narrowed to a single groove. But there's another reading here as well. The story can be understood as a warning about the narcotic household rather than a celebration of it. When Alice drinks from unmarked bottles and eats from mysterious cakes, she is engaging in the dangerous behavior that Victorian children were actually encouraged to do. Medicine cabinets were not locked. Bottles were not clearly labeled. Children regularly poisoned themselves or became accidentally dependent on the substances their parents used to keep them quiet. The transformation of the Duchess's baby into a pig, then, becomes a literalization of what opiates do to infants. They transform the child into something that is no longer quite human, something that grunts and cannot speak, something whose mother can abandon without guilt. This reading makes Wonderland not a drug trip but an anti-drug narrative, showing the horror of a world where chemical intervention is normalized and where children learn early that the solution to discomfort is consumption rather than change. The pharmacological landscape of Victorian England was one where boundaries between medicine and poison were deliberately blurred. Cocaine was marketed as a cure for depression. Heroin was sold as a cough suppressant. Arsenic complexion wafers promised beauty. The very concept of drug abuse did not exist in the way we understand it today. Instead, there was simply use, and the line between therapeutic and toxic doses was discovered through trial and often fatal error. Carol's text captures this uncertainty. Alice never knows whether consuming a substance will help or harm her. She takes enormous risks every time she eats or drinks, and the consequences are unpredictable. Sometimes she grows, sometimes she shrinks, sometimes nothing happens. This randomness reflects the actual experience of Victorian pharmaceutical use, where standardized doses did not exist and where the potency of any given preparation could vary wildly. The text becomes a survival guide for navigating this toxic landscape, teaching children to be suspicious of what adults offer them and to recognize that the adults themselves often do not understand the substances they are distributing. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is not a whimsical adventure. It is an intentional or unintentional survival manual for the Victorian child, preparing the young for a world where adults are mad, foolish, or cruel, where authority is arbitrary, and where the very logic of the schoolroom is a tool for suppression. The story warned readers about the industrial indifference of the factory system, the narcotic silence of the household, and the moral architecture of the asylum. It revealed that the structures of power are built on nothing more substantial than collective agreement to pretend they are real. By turning nonsense into a weapon of subversion, Carol provided children with a means to remain uninfected by the dangerous and surreal logic of the adult world. Alice's journey is fundamentally psychological and emotional, one that allows her to solve problems and stand up for herself in a world that seeks to make her either a pawn or an instrument. She learns to question authority, to recognize cruelty disguised as custom, to value her own perceptions even when everyone around her insists she is wrong. These were not skills Victorian society wanted children to develop. These were threats to the entire social order. The story's lasting power comes from its refusal to provide easy comfort. Alice does not find a wise mentor who explains everything. She does not discover that she has special powers. She does not defeat evil through virtue. She survives through stubbornness, through maintaining her sense of self despite constant pressure to abandon it, and through her eventual recognition that the forces arrayed against her have no inherent legitimacy. Wonderland is a coded map of a fracturing mind, yes, but it is also a disturbing revelation of what psychiatrist John Todd would later identify as a humanitarian indictment against a society that sacrificed childhood on the altar of order and industry. The text preserves in narrative form The trauma of neurological disorder, the violence of industrial capitalism, the toxicity of the domestic sphere, the cruelty of education, and the arbitrary nature of state power. It does all of this while maintaining the veneer of a children's story, which allowed it to circulate freely, while its actual message worked like a slow poison against the system it critiqued. When Alice finally declares you're nothing but a pack of cards and watches the Queen's court collapse into chaos, she is not simply waking from a dream. She is performing an act of revolutionary consciousness, naming the powerlessness of power and refusing to grant it legitimacy any longer. This is what makes the ending so profoundly unsettling. Alice returns to her ordinary life, but she cannot unknow what she has learned. She has seen behind the curtain. She has recognized that the Emperor has no clothes, that the Queen has no real power, that the entire structure of Victorian respectability is built on nothing more than collective delusion. And once that recognition happens, it cannot be reversed. The story endures not because of its whimsy, but because its DNA carries a truth too terrible to speak plainly. The greatest threat to a child might come from within their own home. The most dangerous education is the one that teaches obedience. The most profound madness is not the individual who cannot conform, but the society that demands conformity at the cost of humanity. Wonderland is not a magical realm. It is a mirror. And what it reflects is a world where childhood itself was under siege, where innocence was a commodity to be exploited, and where the only survival strategy was to see clearly what everyone else had agreed to pretend was normal. Alice's adventures in Wonderland is a crime scene preserved in narrative form, evidence disguised as entertainment, and once you recognize what you are really reading, the illusion collapses. This is not a story about a girl who had a strange dream. This is a story about a girl who learned that the adult world is fundamentally hostile to her existence, that the institutions designed to protect her are actually mechanisms of control, and that the only way to survive is to see through the performance of normalcy to the violence beneath. Carol gave Victorian children something their society desperately wanted to deny them. He gave them permission to trust their own perceptions, to recognize abuse when it was disguised as care, to question authority when it demanded blind obedience, to value their own sense of self even when everyone around them insisted they should become something else. The rabbit hole is not an escape from reality. It is a tunnel into reality, beneath the sanitized surface that adults present to children, down into the machinery of power and control that actually governs their lives. And the most subversive element of the entire narrative is that Alice survives. She is not rescued. She is not transformed into something acceptable. She simply refuses to accept the logic of Wonderland, maintains her own sense of reason even when it conflicts with everyone around her, and eventually wakes herself up through sheer force of will. This is the survival manual. Not a set of instructions for how to navigate the system, but permission to recognize that the system itself is mad, that the adults are not to be trusted, and that the child's own perceptions and judgments are more reliable than the collective delusions of Victorian society. The story has been sanitized over the decades, turned into countless adaptations that emphasize the whimsy and downplay the horror. But the original text remains, and once you read it with an understanding of what it actually documents, you cannot unsee the darkness. Every supposedly innocent moment reveals itself as a lesson in survival. Every absurd conversation becomes a tutorial in recognizing when authority has no legitimate basis. Every size change reminds the reader that identity is not fixed, that the self under constant assault, and that maintaining any sense of who you are requires active resistance against forces that want to reshape you into something more manageable. Wonderland endures because it tells a truth that remains relevant, that power is arbitrary, that institutions are performances, that childhood is still under siege, though the forms of that siege have changed, and that the only way to survive is to see clearly, trust yourself, and refuse to grant legitimacy to systems that demand your submission while offering nothing but cruelty in return. The fairest of them all was never about beauty. It was about a child marked for death who learned to mark herself for survival instead.